Mark had never thought of himself as the kind of man to make mistakes that could hurt the people he loved most. Married to Laura for over a decade, he believed his life was structured, stable, and predictable. Their house was modest but warm, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in New Jersey. Their children, Emma and Josh, were growing up fast, and family routines filled the days. Yet, beneath the surface, Mark felt a quiet emptiness he didn't quite understand. It wasn't that he didn't love his family, he did, but something inside him ached. A longing for a spark he hadn't realized was missing. He tried to ignore it, burying it in work and daily life, convincing himself that the dull comfort of routine was enough. Then came Sophie. Mark hadn't seen her in years, college friend, someone he had always admired from afar. Their reunion was purely accidental at a local bookstore on a rainy afternoon. She was vibrant, confident, and carried a smile that reminded him of times before responsibilities had taken over his life. They exchanged pleasantries, and before he realized it, they were talking for hours, catching up on stories of their youth, sharing laughter and memories. It felt effortless, like returning to a part of himself he had long neglected. Over the following weeks, their meetings became more frequent. Coffee at quiet cafes, brief encounters in the park, casual walks where they talked about everything and nothing. Mark felt a growing excitement, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He told himself it was innocent, just companionship. Sophie was a friend, someone to talk to about the challenges of adulthood, a reminder of freedom. Yet the truth was more complicated. With every smile, every shared glance, Mark felt a pull he couldn't resist. An attraction that made him question everything he had once believed about his own contentment at home. Laura began noticing subtle changes. Mark was distracted at dinner, lost in thought while the children talked. He lingered on phone calls longer than necessary, his eyes darting to messages he tried to hide. She sensed a distance, small cracks in the connection they had once shared so naturally. Laura loved him deeply, but intuition told her that something was off. Her heart ached with uncertainty, though she had no proof, only a whispering fear she couldn't name. One Friday evening, Mark found himself at Sophie's apartment. He told himself it was just a conversation, a way to sort out feelings he didn't fully understand. They sat on the couch, sharing stories, laughing at jokes only they found funny, reminiscing about days when life felt limitless and unburdened. He felt alive, yet each moment was shadowed by guilt. He loved Laura. He loved his children. But here he was in a space that made him feel both alive and guilty, a tension so sharp it seemed to hum in his chest. Meanwhile, Laura's unease grew. Something in her heart told her that Mark was hiding something. That night, after the children went to bed, she quietly followed him when he left the house. Her steps were careful, silent, though her pulse raced with anxiety and anticipation. She didn't want confrontation, she wanted answers. She kept a distance, remaining unseen as Mark walked to Sophie's building. Her mind spun with questions she feared to ask aloud, imagining worst-case scenarios while hoping for nothing more than truth. From her hiding spot, Laura watched as Mark reached the door. He smiled at Sophie, who greeted him warmly. They talked for a few minutes, unaware that Laura stood there, watching, heart pounding. Her mind flashed through memories of their marriage, every moment of happiness, every shared secret tanned. Suddenly, it felt like those years had condensed into a single heartbeat, a fragile thing she could either protect or see shattered. Mark, for his part, was oblivious to her presence. He felt free talking to Sophie, unburdened for a moment from the responsibilities and routines of home life. He laughed in a way he hadn't laughed in years, his guard down, a side of him that belonged to youth rather than marriage. Sophie noticed it too, her eyes lighting up at his energy. But neither of them realized that the very person he had promised to protect was witnessing this, hidden yet profoundly present. Laura's first impulse was to confront him, to demand explanations, to scream at the injustice of what she was witnessing. But she stopped herself. Anger felt too easy, too shallow, compared to the deeper need she had to understand the truth, to hear it straight from him. She waited silently, holding her emotions in check while the scene unfolded before her. Then it happened. A small sound, Mark's footsteps shifting, A soft laugh alerted Sophie to the possibility someone was nearby. Laura stepped from the shadows. The air seemed to still. Mark's face went pale, his smile fading as he recognized her. Sophie froze a question in her eyes. Laura didn't speak immediately. She simply looked at them, her gaze steady, sharp, and calm. There was no shouting, no rage, no immediate confrontation, only a presence so firm that the room seemed to pause around it. Mark's mind raced. What could he say? How could he explain? He had crossed lines he hadn't fully recognized, and now the truth stood before him undeniable and silent. Sophie looked to him, then to Laura, unsure of how to respond, but Laura raised a hand slightly, signaling for patience. She did not accuse, she did not shout. She simply watched, holding her composure like a shield against the storm. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled not broadly, not warmly, but in a way that conveyed complexity, hurt, yes, but also clarity, and a willingness to confront reality rather than emotion alone. She stepped forward, inviting them to talk inside. Mark's confusion deepened. He had expected confrontation, perhaps even anger that would spiral into chaos. Instead, Laura offered calm, a measured approach that demanded honesty and reflection. Inside. Laura sat down with Mark and Sophie, and her voice was steady. She spoke of her feelings, of the unease she had sensed, the cracks she had noticed in their daily life. She described the subtle loneliness that had crept in over the years, and the fear she had felt at noticing Mark's distraction. There was no accusation, no blame-laden words, only truth, spoken with quiet authority. Mark listened, his throat tight, realizing for the first time the impact of every choice he had made in secrecy. Sophie remained quiet, seeing the gravity of the situation in a new light, understanding that the emotional consequences were far deeper than any momentary connection. The room was charged with tension, but also with a strange relief. Laura's calm approach allowed honesty to emerge without shaming or violence. Mark felt the weight of guilt not as punishment, but as awareness on understanding of the consequences of his actions and the chance to begin making amends. The encounter, while shocking, became a turning point. He realized that confronting the truth, even when it hurt, is the only way forward. The night stretched on with conversations that were raw, emotional, and necessary. Laura listened, Mark confessed, and Sophie acknowledged the reality of the situation. There was no drama, no shouting, no betrayal-filled accusations that would have made the night unbearable. Instead, there was recognition of mistakes, of human longing, and the complexities of love. Laura's unexpected composure and emotional intelligence transformed what could have been a scene of destruction into a moment of reflection and the possibility of healing. By the end of the night, Mark felt the first tremors of clarity. The path forward was uncertain, but the first step had been taken not through avoidance or secrecy, but through the courage to face reality, to admit mistakes, and to allow feelings to be expressed without fear of instant judgment. He understood that what had seemed like the end could also become a beginning, if he approached it with honesty and humility. And as he left Sophie's apartment that night, Laura walking beside him silently, Mark realized that life had shifted irreversibly. The next days would demand more courage, more conversations, and more honesty than he had ever faced. But for the first time in years, he felt alive not in the reckless thrill of secrecy, but in the raw, uncomfortable, and real connection of truth. The first part of this story ends here, with a tension that is unresolved but full of emotional depth. It is a moment of recognition, a pause before decisions, a cliffhanger not of danger, but of choice. How will Mark confront the reality of his actions? And how will Laura respond to the emotional truth now laid bare before them? The morning after the confrontation was quiet, almost eerily so. Mark woke to the familiar sounds of Emma and Josh moving about the house, breakfast sizzling on the stove, and Laura's steady presence somewhere in the background. Yet something had shifted. The previous night's events lingered in his mind like a shadow he could not shake. And every thought carried the weight of choices he had long avoided facing. He knew there was no undoing what had been set in motion. no erasing the truth that had now been exposed. Laura, for her part, moved through the morning with careful composure. She smiled at the children, helped them with breakfast, and asked about their plans for the day, but her eyes betrayed a quiet resolve. The air between her and Mark was heavy, charged with unspoken questions, and a mutual awareness that the next steps would require more than apologies. They would require honesty, reflection, and courage. Mark tried to speak, to offer words that might bridge the gap between guilt and understanding. But every sentence faltered under the weight of reality. Laura simply listened, nodding, giving him space to find the words he so desperately wanted to say. The children left for school, their laughter echoing down the driveway, leaving the house almost empty. Mark and Laura remained in the kitchen, the silence stretching between them like an invisible line. He finally broke it, his voice low but firm. "Laura, I don't know how to fix this. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted." He paused, struggling to find clarity. I feel like I've lost myself somewhere along the way, and I made choices I can't take back." Laura regarded him quietly, her hands folded in front of her. She didn't interrupt, didn't scold, but her gaze was unwavering. "I know," she said finally. "I felt it too, long before last night. You weren't the only one drifting, Mark. We both stopped paying attention to each other, to the marriage, to ourselves. But that doesn't make this easy, and it doesn't erase what's happened." Her voice was steady, not filled with anger, but with the pain of reality. They spent the morning talking, not about blame, but about truth. Mark admitted to the feelings he had developed for Sophie, the longing he couldn't explain, and the excitement that had made him forget himself. Laura listened, occasionally interjecting with questions, probing gently, not to punish, but to understand. The honesty was uncomfortable, even painful, but it was necessary. For the first time in months, they were speaking without pretenses, without avoidance, facing the emotional fractures that had silently grown beneath their family life. After hours of conversation, Laura suggested that Mark step outside for a moment. He hesitated but eventually agreed, stepping into the garden. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of spring blossoms. He felt the sun on his face, but warmth did little to ease the tightness in his chest. Memories of Sophie, the laughter, the shared moments, and the guilt of being caught swirled together in a chaotic storm. He realized he had been running from responsibility, chasing fleeting feelings without considering the consequences. When he returned inside, Laura was still seated at the table, her expression unreadable but calm. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with intention. "We need to decide what we do next, Mark. Not just about last night, but about everything. About us, our children, our marriage. This isn't something that can be ignored or swept under the rug." Mark nodded, fully aware that the decisions ahead were monumental. They weren't just about feelings, they were about rebuilding trust, about examining their marriage, and about confronting the realities of their lives together. The day moved forward in a strange rhythm. Mark tried to immerse himself in household tasks, anything to occupy his mind and delay the inevitable emotional reckoning. He repaired a loose kitchen cabinet, mended a broken fence plank, sticked, and even washed the car in an attempt to regain some sense of control. But every action was shadowed by reflection, by the haunting awareness that his choices had consequences far beyond himself. Late in the afternoon, Mark received a message from Sophie. She wrote briefly, expressing her concern and confusion, her awareness of the gravity of the situation, and a desire to respect whatever decisions he and Laura needed to make. Mark read it carefully, his heart torn between relief and guilt. He hadn't intended to hurt anyone, yet the ripple effects of his actions had already begun to unfold. He realized that Sophie's life, Laura's life, and even his own would now be intertwined in ways that demanded careful navigation and thoughtful honesty. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Laura suggested they take a walk. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets lined with blooming trees and soft lamplight, giving the world a tranquil appearance that contrasted sharply with the turmoil they felt inside. They walked side by side, neither speaking at first, letting the silence allow their thoughts to settle. Mark felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly, but the weight in his heart remained. Finally, Laura spoke. "Mark, I love you. I don't know if we can go back to the way things were, but I want us to try. I want us to be honest with each other, even when it hurts, and to rebuild not just for us, but for Emma and Josh." Her words were steady, but they carried an immense emotional gravity. Mark felt a swell of gratitude, but also an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He realized that love alone was not enough. Commitment, honesty, and effort would be required to repair what had been broken. They continued walking, discussing practical steps, counseling, clearer communication, and boundaries that would help rebuild trust. They agreed that Sophie needed to step back, giving space for their marriage to be assessed without external pressure. Mark felt a sense of relief mixed with sadness, relief that there was a path forward, sadness for the hurt he had caused. The walk lasted hours, but it felt like a single extended moment of truth. Over the next week, Mark and Laura began attending couples counseling. Each session was intense, emotionally charged, and exhausting. They confronted feelings they had long ignored: resentment, unspoken disappointments, and the silent gaps that had grown between them over the years. Mark confessed his insecurities, his longings, and his mistakes, while Laura expressed the pain, the fear, and the betrayal she had felt. Each revelation was a wound, but also a step toward healing. They were learning not just to communicate, but to listen, to empathize, and to understand the emotional landscapes that had been neglected in their marriage. Through it all, Mark realized the depth of his love for Laura. It wasn't the shallow excitement he had felt with Sophie, nor the fleeting thrill of forbidden attention. It was grounded, complex, and enduring. It encompassed anger and forgiveness, disappointment and hope, guilt and redemption. He also realized that the consequences of his actions were not just lessons, but opportunities to rebuild, to reconnect, and to strengthen the bonds that had been taken for granted. By the end of part 2, the stage was set for real transformation. Mark and Laura were not the same people they had been before the incident. Their marriage had been shaken, tested, and exposed to its most vulnerable points. But the exposure had also opened doors to understanding, empathy, and a deeper connection. They were facing the storm together, acknowledging the pain while also embracing the possibility of renewal. And yet, unresolved tension lingered. Sophie's presence, even in the periphery, reminded Mark of choices made and paths considered. Laura's willingness to forgive and communicate created hope, but it also demanded accountability. The emotional terrain was complex, and the next steps would determine whether their bond would survive or fracture under the strain. The cliffhanger was not one of immediate danger, but of profound emotional stakes. Could love, honesty, and effort overcome the breach of trust? Could they rebuild not just their marriage, but themselves? This part concludes with Mark and Laura at a critical crossroads. They have faced the initial shock, begun honest conversations, and initiated steps to repair their relationship. The emotional stakes are high, the tension unresolved. And the story poised for the final part: confrontation with the past, reconciliation, and resolution. The following days were a mixture of quiet reflection and purposeful action. Mark and Laura woke each morning with the weight of the previous weeks lingering, but also with a shared determination. They began setting aside time to talk, not just about the incident, but about their lives, their priorities, and the marriage they both wanted to save. Their conversations were not always easy. Sometimes they spiraled into painful memories or disagreements, but each one ended with a sense of progress, however small. They were learning to speak without defensiveness, to listen without judgment, and to recognize the humanity in each other. Even when it was difficult, Mark committed to being transparent in every part of his life, sharing his thoughts, feelings, and schedule. With Laura, this wasn't just about regaining trust. It was about showing her that he was no longer hiding, no longer taking the path of convenience over honesty. Laura, in turn, began expressing her emotions openly, whether it was frustration, sadness, or hope. The tension in their home, which had once been unspoken and simmering, began to ease. replaced with a cautious but growing sense of connection. Counseling sessions became a cornerstone of their recovery. Each week, they sat in a quiet, sunlit office with a counselor who guided them through exercises in empathy, accountability, and forgiveness. They revisited moments that had led to their estrangement, discussing choices they had made and times they had failed to support each other. Mark admitted to the feelings that had drawn him to Sophie and reflected on why he had allowed the emotional distance between him and Laura to grow. Laura spoke about the loneliness she had felt, the way she had tried to reach him, and the despair of feeling invisible in her own marriage. These sessions were draining, emotionally taxing, but necessary. They revealed the layers of misunderstanding, unspoken hurt, and unmet needs that had accumulated over the years. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Mark and Laura decided to take a long walk through their neighborhood. The sun had just begun to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Walking side by side, they reflected on the week's work and the progress they had made. "I never realized how much we'd let ourselves drift," Mark said quietly. "It's like we were living in the same house but in different worlds." Laura nodded, her hand brushing against his as they walked. "I know, but at least now we're in the same world again. It's messy and it hurts, but we're here together." The following days brought challenges. Mark had to navigate interactions with Sophie carefully, maintaining clear boundaries without being disrespectful. He sent her a message explaining that he needed space to focus on his marriage, and she responded with understanding and support. Even though it was difficult for both of them, Laura, too, had to confront her own feelings of jealousy and hurt. Learning to trust Mark's commitment through consistent actions rather than words alone, they were both discovering that rebuilding trust was not a single act, but a series of decisions made every day to honor the relationship they wanted to preserve. As the weeks passed, small moments of reconnection began to emerge. Mark started preparing breakfast for Laura, something he hadn't done in years, and she would leave little notes of encouragement for him. They laughed together at mundane things, shared memories from when they first met, and found joy in simple gestures. The house felt warmer, lighter, and less tense. Emma and Josh noticed the change too. The children began sharing more openly about their days, their laughter returning to the walls of the home. One night, after putting the kids to bed, Mark and Laura sat in the living room, the room dimly lit by a single lamp. The conversation turned to the future. "I don't want us to just survive this," Laura said. "I want us to thrive. I want to remember why we fell in love, why we chose each other in the first place." Mark reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I do too. I know it won't be perfect, but I promise I'll do everything I can to make it right. To be the partner you deserve." Laura's eyes glistened, not with sadness, but with hope. They decided to create new routines that emphasized connection. Weekly date nights, shared hobbies, and scheduled times to talk without distractions. They also committed to family rituals, ensuring that Emma and Josh felt secure and loved throughout the process. The small, intentional actions became the foundation for rebuilding trust. Mark learned that consistency mattered more than grand gestures, and Laura discovered that forgiveness was not a single choice, but a daily practice of patience and understanding. Months passed, and slowly, the marriage began to feel stable again. The tension that had once dominated their home became rare, replaced by laughter, shared responsibilities, and genuine companionship. Mark no longer felt drawn to Sophie in the same way her presence had been a symptom of emotional distance, not a replacement for the love he had for Laura. Laura found strength in seeing Mark's efforts, realizing that actions often spoke louder than words. Their bond, once fragile, was beginning to feel resilient. The story reached its quiet resolution one Sunday afternoon. Mark and Laura hosted a small family gathering in their backyard. Emma and Josh played games with their friends, while Mark and Laura prepared lemonade and snacks, exchanging smiles and easy conversation. They paused for a moment, standing together and watching the children laugh. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was real, filled with a sense of healing and the promise of continued growth. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Mark and Laura sat on the porch swing. The sky was clear, the stars beginning to peek through the night, and the air was calm. "We made it," Laura whispered. "We're still here." Mark nodded, wrapping his arm around her shoulder. "We did. And I know there will be challenges, but we've proven we can face them together. That's what matters." They sat in silence for a while, letting the stillness affirm what words could not fully express: that love, when combined with honesty, accountability, and effort, could endure even the harshest trials. Their marriage had been tested, shaken, and strained, but it had survived because they faced the truth, communicated openly, and chose each other every day. As the night deepened, Mark and Laura went inside, turning off the lights one by one. The house was quiet, the earlier chaos replaced by peace. They had confronted the consequences of choices made in haste and weakness, had addressed the fractures in their relationship, and emerged with a renewed commitment. The journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. And though the memory of Sophie and the events of the past lingered as a reminder of human imperfection, it no longer held the power to divide them. Mark and Laura understood that the true strength of their relationship lay in their ability to forgive, rebuild, and move forward together. They had navigated grief, guilt, and temptation, and emerged with clarity. Love was not flawless, but it was enduring when nurtured with intention. The story closed on a note of cautious hope. Mark and Laura were not perfect, but they were committed. They knew challenges would continue to arise, but they also knew they had the tools and the willingness to face them. They had rebuilt a foundation stronger than before, anchored in honesty, understanding, and mutual respect. And as they held each other that night, they realized that even in the aftermath of betrayal, love could survive and even grow stronger when met with effort, empathy, and the courage to confront the truth.